Assalamu alaikum. Welcome to a new episode of the Global Dawah Movement Show. On today's show, we're going to be discussing an interesting proposition. When someone says, I am an atheist, they have just shown that God exists. Interesting idea. On the show with me, I have brother Hamza Sotsi. Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
How are you, Akhi?
Good, bro. Very good.
So, that particular statement, that seems quite controversial. So if someone says, I am an atheist, with pride, they have just shown that God exists. How is that the case?
Well, it's nothing to do with the fact that they've used the word atheist. They can say, I am a lemur, I am a human, I am agnostic, I am Muslim, I am Christian, I am sad. Because the key word here is I. The minute you use I is the minute you're referring to the self. The minute you refer to the self is the minute you're referring to a conscious thing, to a conscious organism. And it's the reality of consciousness that is a signpost, an indicator, a premise, a piece of evidence for theism, or in other words, for the existence of God.
Why is that the case? Why would you make that jump?
Excellent. Because of the hard problem of consciousness. So we're not addressing things like someone can think, someone can feel pain, and we could map out neurochemical pathways, neurochemical happenings, and correlate it to pain, and correlate it to things like movement. That's not a problem. The hard problem is based on two main things. Number one, that there is an inner first person subjective conscious state. And number two, that this inner first person conscious state emerges from physical processes.
Okay, now that's quite a lot of things in what you've just said. So would you give an example of what a hard problem would be for me, say?
Okay, good. Say, for example, I gave you a piece of chocolate and you ate the chocolate, and I would ask you a question. How did it feel having the chocolate?
I'd say it's sweet, nutty, creamy.
Good. So
Something like
sweet, nutty, creamy. Now, the hard problem is this, that there is a inner subjective experience, also known as a phenomenal state or qualia. There's an inner subjective conscious experience that you're having concerning chocolate. And you've described it as nutty, creamy, and sweet. Now those words are vehicles to meaning. That meaning is a representation of that inner subjective experience. I, or any scientist, cannot access what it's like for you to have that inner subjective experience of eating the chocolate that's nutty, creamy, and sweet. That's the hard problem. And the other part of the hard problem is that we don't know why that inner subjective conscious experience emerges from physical biological processes. And this is well known. For example, Professor David Chalmers, Professor Torin Alter, Professor Thomas Nagel, and many others, they appreciate that there is a hard problem of consciousness.
Couldn't someone just say, okay, there seems to be a problem here, but we used to think, how does it rain? Science worked that out. There's always gaps, and then scientists work it out. Okay, we have a gap with consciousness. Science will work it out. It's not really a big issue.
I totally agree, but this is not a scientific question. It's a metaphysical question. Hence, I wrote an essay for my postgraduate studies on does consciousness pose a special problem for science? And it was in my metaphysics class. Because it's a metaphysical question. If you attend any university lecture on metaphysics, you see that consciousness is actually something that is discussed. So it's a metaphysical question, meaning we accept all of the science. We accept science is very powerful and it has the potential, based on our past experience, to answer fundamental questions concerning the how, concerning physical processes, because science has a limit, has a scope. As Professor Elliot Sober, who's a philosopher of science, says, that scientists are limited to they're
Observations at
observations,
hand,
and they're not infinite, are they? They're always limited and time bound. So the point here is, even if I were to know everything about your brain, map out all the neurochemical pathways, all of them, and correlate them to every instance and every conscious experience, inner conscious experience, we will never be able to find out what it's like for you to have that conscious experience and why that conscious experience emerges from physical processes.
So this is not in any way a God of the gaps.
It's not God of the gaps. It's not saying we don't have enough science and there's a gap in the science, so therefore we're squeezing God in an explanation. No, it's an outdated atheist cliche to claim that this is God of the gaps. It's not, because it's about the metaphysic of it.
Yeah.
If we knew everything about your brain, mapped out all the neurochemical pathways, we'll still not be able to find out what it's like for you to have inner conscious subjective experience and why that experience emerges from physical processes.
We're nearly there. There's just one big question. Why God?
Yes,
Clearly science can't explain, even if it, no matter how far it progresses, it's a metaphysical question. Why is God the best explanation for the hard problem?
Okay, just a note to the listeners and the people who are watching this. We haven't yet explained the competing approaches to the philosophy of the mind. For example, eliminative materialism, emergent materialism, reductive materialism, functionalism, behavioralism, all the isms and schisms concerning this, because that's for a later show. And also making the kind of logical link between the hard problem of consciousness and God's existence also requires another show. So this show was very introductory, just to plant the seed concerning the hard problem of consciousness, and now just to introduce why it can lead to God's existence. Because of a simple fact, that we have internal subjective conscious states, we have consciousness. How can inner subjective consciousness emerge and arise from non-conscious, blind, cold, physical processes?
It's like getting something from nothing.
It's like getting something from nothing. Like
life from non-life.
If I have £10, I can give you £10. But if I don't have £10, I can't give it to you. You can only give something to something if you have it. Blind, cold, random physical processes do not have internal subjective experiences, so they can't give that to a complex organism like myself. So that's a key point here. Why do these physical processes produce consciousness, right? The other key point is that we have internal subjective awareness. Where did that come from? When was the last time you saw an electron that had internal subjective awareness? And the concept of consciousness is a unified conscious experience. You can't have individual pieces of matter having conscious experiences, because it doesn't make sense of a unified conscious experience, because what's a thought without a thinker? You need a unified conscious experience. So the point here is we have inner subjective conscious awareness. So, matter doesn't have that. So where did it come from? So it makes sense that an all-aware being created the universe, that created human beings with inner subjective consciousness, and that they're aware of the inner subjective conscious states. And you could even maybe describe this being as a conscious being, meaning all-knowing, it's alive. This is part of the Islamic tradition. Allah is alive. He's ever-living, and He's all-knowing, and He's all-aware. So therefore that makes sense that there are beings, human beings, that also have awareness of the inner subjective conscious states.
And the sources.
And exactly, and the source is the creator, and that we do have consciousness. It didn't emerge from blind, non-conscious physical processes. So I think that's a starting point. We're going to continue with future shows, but hopefully this has raised thinking. And for people to research this further, this is mainstream stuff, by the way.
Yeah,
maybe not the conclusion, but the hard problem of consciousness is absolutely mainstream stuff. Professor Thomas Nagel, Professor David Chalmers, Professor Torin Alter, Professor Antti Ravonsio, and many others.
Okay, that's a really good summary. And I know some of the people who are watching this show, they may say, there are contentions to what you just said, and there's also other material explanations.
That's future shows.
Those are going to be, inshallah, for future shows, but I hope the audience here has benefited from a very simple introduction to the hard problem of consciousness, why science can't give an explanation for that even if it progresses, and why God is the best explanation. Jazakallah khair for listening. Assalamu alaikum.